Welcome to the Titan Talks webinar to listen to and learn from the fifth speaker in this relatively new Titan Talks Innovation Series. I'm John Corton. I'm the director of the Petrick Idea Center at Illinois Wesleyan University. And for those of you who haven't yet heard of our plans for the Petrick Idea Center, we're building a state-of-the-art 43,000 square foot living, learning, and creating community right here on the beautiful IWU campus on the southwest corner of the quad between Buck Memorial Library and the Memorial Center. It will have flexible common areas, a fully equipped maker and creator spaces, and residential capacity for 78 of the university's most innovative and entrepreneurially minded students. Here, all students at Illinois Wesleyan, across every major and discipline, will practice collaborative, cross-discipline creativity with a conscience. As they live, learn, and create 24/7, they develop their skills there, and they'll also build the products and the services and initiatives that result in virtuous solutions to vital problems. The Petrick Idea Center is going to offer students, alumni, and the community lifelong learning and engagement opportunities. This quarterly innovation series, which we just first introduced in January of 2022, it's a really perfect example of what's to come. This series features alumni, like our guest speaker today, and university supporters who are creating, changing, and disrupting the products, the services, the systems, and the policies that will exist in the mid-21st century world. Assisting us with moderating the Q&A for today's webinar is a current IW student entrepreneur, Elizabeth Stein. Liz, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your startup?
Thank you, John. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Like John said, my name is Liz Stein. I am the editor-in-chief of Oak Paw Publishing, which is a small independent publisher that I started specifically when I saw the Titan New Venture Challenge was existing. I have so far won $1,500 from the university towards starting my company. And now I have submissions open for 3 anthologies and general submissions. But the overall point of the company is that I actively am seeking to give authors and poets of every marginalized community the opportunity to have their words heard, with a special note to members of the neurodiverse community. Equity, creativity, and compassion are keystones to this vision. And I really want to celebrate the things that make us each unique while finding the similarities that connect us all as people. And honestly, I never would have been able to get this off the ground without Wesleyan. So I am so happy to be a part of this.
Thank you, Liz. We're very happy that you're a part of the Wesleyan family. A few housekeeping items before we get started with today's webinar. You're viewing this webinar as an audience member, so therefore you're not going to have the ability to turn on your video or your microphone. However, questions can be submitted at any time through the Q&A feature below. Kris will answer questions during and at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues, you can reach out to the Office of Alumni Engagement at 309-556-3145, or you can send an email to iwalum@iwu.edu. A recording of today's webinar is going to be available to view on the Office of Alumni Engagement YouTube page, and you'll be sent a link and a short survey in the days ahead. Illinois Wesleyan is very honored to have 1984 alumna, Dr. Christine Condon, as the fifth speaker of our innovation series. Kris comes to Titan Talks with backgrounds in community college leadership, corporate training, and legal and civics studies. After completing her undergraduate degree at Illinois Wesleyan University, she worked as a paralegal for the Illinois Supreme Court. While pursuing her master's degree in corporate training and development at Loyola University in Chicago, Kris worked as a graduate assistant in undergraduate teacher education, and as a national officer, helped launch the Loyola chapter of Sigma Kappa sorority. Kris spent 22 years on the faculty of Kankakee Community College as its workplace development trainer to create customized corporate training solutions for the area's business and technology partners. She also served as a director of the college's ABA-approved paralegal training program and launched the Illinois Civics Academy for Teachers, the first ever civics higher education program funded by the Robert R. McCormick Foundation that focused exclusively on Illinois government and civic engagement. Kris earned her doctorate in community college leadership from National Louis University, focusing her research on the innovative characteristics of business and education training partnerships. In 2014, Kris was a recipient of Illinois Wesleyan's Loyalty Award because of her decades of work serving as the IW alumni class newsletter editor, her work on alumni class reunion committees, and for serving as an advisor and mentor for so many Illinois Wesleyan students. You're a great example of paying it forward, Kris, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, John, for that warm introduction. I'm very grateful, and to the alumni team and the Petrick Idea Center, and to Liz Stein, who I've just gotten to know, who is a budding entrepreneur and education student who's going to put all of those things together to do some really wonderful, innovative types of things. It's really an honor to get to work with you, Liz. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and hello to all of my Wesleyan friends. A special shout out to my dear friends from the classes of 84 and 85. I understand Deb Stack is on the call, and I believe my dear friend Sam Porritt and my friend Amy Weeding are on the call. And if I've missed anybody else, I'm going to hope to get that list of those names a little bit later so that we can all visit. But thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about something that is very interesting to me and has always been of personal interest to me. And I'm really interested also to hear what your thoughts are about some of the distinctions that I try and draw here between being an entrepreneur and having what the research refers to as an entrepreneurial orientation. Those things really are not quite the same. And I hope that what I researched as part of my doctoral work will help to maybe inform some strategies for you as well. So as we go ahead and start here, you saw the overview of today's presentation, and this was part of the registration. But just a little backstory on this. You know, when I was a student at Wesleyan, I majored in social science and I minored in world language, and I earned what in today's vernacular is called a professional educator's license. And while virtually all of my career has been in the classroom, I really found that my niche was working with adult learners. And as John said, in 2020, I retired after 31 years of service to the Illinois court system and Illinois public higher education, the last 22 of those being on the faculty at Kankakee Community College, which is just south of Chicago on I-57. What was really unique about that job was that I had this very non-traditional teaching load, because I went out and did the bulk of my education classroom work with business and with industry. And what I did for them in what we'll call non-credit education was identical to what we would have done with those students had they come to us in a traditional college credit 16-week course environment. In other words, the way that I would assess learning was the same. The goals and objectives of the training were the same. The strategies that I would use to foster teaching and learning were the same. Even the curriculum was the same. The distinction was that I worked in the non-credit side of the house. And the value to that experience was that our non-credit department really, I believe, demonstrated some entrepreneurialism in a way that impacted our college's bottom line. And I'm going to show you some hard statistics on that in a minute. But what I was always intrigued by was the way that we built partnerships, because in Kankakee, we had what was called an economic alliance, which was made up of the 50 largest businesses in the county. And of those 50 businesses, I provided customized training and curriculum to 31 of them during my career. And I was a revenue generating faculty member in that way. And it made me wonder whether other institutions were doing this same kind of work to deliver curriculum to community stakeholders. I wasn't really sure. And so when I went back to school, I decided that I wanted to focus my doctoral research on entrepreneurialism in higher education. So what you're going to see today is a snapshot of 3 years of my life and my findings, and the ways in which I think the Illinois Wesleyans of the world can really practice this approach to teaching and learning and innovation. But before we go there, I'd like to give you a little bit of some background of the research so that this really feels like something that's immediately applicable to you in your own work lives. So here's a little interesting backstory about the way we do things in this place that is uniquely Illinois. There was a time not so long ago when the state of Illinois went for over 2 years without a budget, let alone a balanced one. And what a lot of folks didn't know at that time was that Illinois was already 2 years in arrears to funding public institutions like mine. So in other words, when I retired from Kankakee in 2020, my institution didn't get fully reimbursed for all of the courses I had taught that year until last year. So as you'll see, I think the approaches that we had to partnerships with our business and our industrial colleagues really gave us some sorely needed funding during that budget impasse. And it's one of the reasons why an entrepreneurial partnership can be important. They can provide revenue streams that can be used to sustain budgets, is certainly what was the case with us. They can go into a rainy day fund or on the wish list for the wish list of projects. They can be used to creatively fund supplemental or remedial services, or they can reinvest back into the area of the college that generated the revenue, thereby making it self-sustaining. And that's really important for us in higher education to think about when we look at the Illinois-based institutions that have struggled so mightily since the 2010s. For example, Robert Morris University ceased operations altogether and has been absorbed by Roosevelt University. Scheimer College, which was a small liberal arts great books institution, has been absorbed by North Central College in Naperville. Calumet College of St. Joseph still operates in Indiana, but ceased operations altogether in Illinois. And finally, Lincoln College, which is literally down the street from Illinois Wesleyan, closed its doors during the pandemic. Now, I'm not suggesting that these organizations did not practice entrepreneurialism. That would be an unfair statement to make. And to be fair, we have to look at some of the other variables that were at play here. And there's a lot of research that backs this up. Number one, we know that the number of high school graduates declined from 3.1 million in the 1970s to 2.5 million in 1994. But college enrollment actually increased when we look at some of the collapse at that time of well-paying blue-collar jobs. So we know that in the mid-70s, the number of high school students who immediately went on to college was about 51%. And by 1997, it had gone up to about 67%. And then we had the Great Recession, and we know the impact that the recession of 2008, 2009 had on higher education. We know state tax revenues fell by the wayside. University budgets were slashed. For example, between 2009 and 2012, Pennsylvania cut public funding to higher education by 19%, which is $430 million. And then we also see with this whole global financial problem, as one author called it, a bomb with an 18-year fuse, because birth rates reversed and began to plummet. So then what do we see on the heels of that? By the early 2010s, enrollment starts to drop. And by 2019, which was the last full year for this data prior to the pandemic, undergraduate enrollment drops down to 16.6 million. So the problem that lots of higher education organizations are having right now is they've hit a ceiling in terms of how many 18-year-olds they can recruit onto a physical campus. We know that the percentage of young adults with a high school diploma is in excess of 94%. But we also know that immediately leaving high school going to college, that immediate enrollment rate is pretty flat now. It's been right around 70% pre-COVID, and it's now dipping a little bit as the job market is heating up for lower wage workers who don't need the same level or degree of skills. So all of this was analyzed by an economist at Carleton College in Minnesota by the name of Nathan Grawe. And he used all of these statistics to create what he calls this higher education demand index, which tries to predict the ways in which colleges will be able to forecast enrollment. And he suggests that really selective, highly selective colleges and universities are going to be least affected because they've got power in the marketplace. But he also argues that there will be certain regions of the country and certain states, and he specifically singles out Illinois, where he talks about the fact that the demand for a four-year university could potentially decrease by 15% or more. So I'm looking at all of this and I'm thinking, well, if we've tapped out the market, there's got to be research on the ways that we try and recruit and retain these types of students. So off I go with my trusty pen and paper and my computer, and I try and find this research on how higher education can be more entrepreneurial. And what do I find? Well, I find that there's a gap in the research on this. Actually, I think the phrase that I used to my dissertation chair was it was a gaping, ginormous, cavernous chasm. There is zero research here on how higher education and entrepreneurial organizations can foster these partnerships. And I couldn't find anything about the ways in which there were creative approaches to delivering instruction as a way to recruit students. But what I did hear was a lot of concern among the higher education community that innovating in non-traditional ways was going to make the institution beholden to corporate America, that they were worried about turning into corporate universities where funding would be contingent upon what faculty taught. And of course, faculty would be all kinds of unhappy about that, and I certainly would be too. But I knew from my own experience that I had never been told by a client what to teach at the risk of delivering a contract. Everything that we designed was always grounded in quantitative and qualitative data. What I wanted to find was some evidence of partnerships that could give us some continuous quality improvement for both the higher ed institution and the business partner, and some evidence of the ways in which maybe teachers could teach innovatively and bring cohorts and bridges from certificates to degrees together in order to improve the enrollment numbers and thereby be a win-win for everybody. Because I knew that for really so many of us, the gift of going to an 18 to 22-year-old residential campus and completing a four-year degree in 4 years is something that is becoming less and less common. And that for higher education in that construct to survive and thrive, there needs to be other ways that we can recruit wonderfully well-qualified students to have the same kind of experience, albeit maybe not traditional residential, but ways in which we could partner with business and industry so that both sides are sustaining and working together. So this is what I decided to investigate myself. And the long and the short of it is I came up with these 4 questions, and I'm going to share with you my findings on these questions in just a moment. But let me give you a really quick primer here on how I went about surveying people to get answers to these questions. So in Illinois, the Illinois Public Community College system has 48 institutions across the state. And their goal is, of course, to make the first 2 years of undergraduate education accessible. Now, of those 48 institutions, there are 11 of them that are found in what are known as systems. So for example, the City Colleges of Chicago and the Illinois Eastern Community Colleges. And I excluded those systems from my research because I was then comparing, apples and oranges. And I also eliminated my own institution from the organizations I surveyed. So what I did was to come up with these 4 questions that I surveyed to the remaining 36 community colleges in the state of Illinois. And what I've done here in my findings is to put a bit of an IWU spin on these to maybe give you some practice implications. But I surveyed these 36 schools to get some quantitative information on the ways in which they generated revenue and the kinds of work that they did with business and industry. And of the 36 of them I found, 21 of them agreed to answer my questions, which I thought was pretty good. And of the 21 who agreed to answer my questions, 5 of those 21 agreed for me to interview them and one of their business and industry partners. So the power to that was it gave me an opportunity to gather more qualitative findings to really determine what the value was to them of entrepreneurialism. And to give you a sense of the way that being entrepreneurially oriented can add value in dollars and cents to a business institution, let me give you this real life example. This was from a corporate training contract that I had done with one of those large economic alliance organizations in Kankakee County. They wanted me to do a series of Microsoft computer courses for all of their employees. And they wanted a Microsoft certified instructor, and they wanted it done on site, and they wanted it done at certain times. And so, you know, we wanted to make sure and accommodate them. The content was identical to what those students would have gained if they had come to a 16-week course with me. But some of the big differentiators were that I went and did training on third shift. So nothing more exciting than teaching Excel from 11 to 7, right, with the graveyard shift at a company. I did things in a compressed format because we didn't have the luxury of 16 weeks when they went back on shift. But everything else for them was identical. The book, the outcomes, how things were graded, how things were delivered. The only distinctions were that I went to them and that there was a compressed format that was in place. And from a cost factor, what we knew was that my boss would have had to pay about $1,920 in salary to me for this training and purchased materials at about $3,700. So it would have cost Kankakee about $5,600 to actually just send me out and do this training. Now in Illinois, remember, we're still getting funded 2 years late, and certain courses get funded at certain levels. So it turned out that the state of Illinois was going to reimburse us a whopping $3,161 to help a client that we were outlaying $5,634 to assist. So, you know, we're all about being philanthropic, but we can't take a bath every time we go ahead and try and serve a client. So what we did in that situation was to enter into an hourly rate contract with this client, which would have been cheaper, it was cheaper, than the client going and hiring a private trainer. And we took that $2,500 loss and we turned it into an almost $31,000 profit for Kankakee by going ahead and billing the client for that time and generating revenue for the institution as well. So how did we go about doing all this? Well, there's kind of some interesting strategy to this. It's actually a strategy that's known as the entrepreneurial orientation construct. And the orientation part of this is super important to a full understanding of why this would be valuable. And I go so far as to say that I believe our own Liz Stein here is a practicing model of this with Oak Paw Publishing. And I think when you think about what we're going to discuss here relative to what she shared with you, I think you'll see I'm on point with this. So let me give you a little bit of the background of how we get to this entrepreneurial orientation construct. When you talk about the word entrepreneurship, just generally, the goal is it spurs expansion and growth and development. That's what it means to be an entrepreneur. You want to be able to spur something as a characteristic of a successful business. And that original theory goes all the way back to 1934 by this Harvard economist who fled Nazi Germany by the name of Schumpeter, who says that it's capitalism that spurs entrepreneurship and people with, I love this quote, sharper intelligence and agile imagination can produce countless combinations, end quote. Well, you fast forward to this, and by the mid-1980s, an economist by the name of Miller talks about the fact that, yeah, it's important that you have people who are willing to spur innovation, but he says it's organizations and not just people that spur that entrepreneurialism. And he suggests that organizations who are proactive, innovative, and risk takers, like Liz, are the people who really demonstrate being entrepreneurial. And then by the late 1980s, Koven and Slevin do this study, and they say if you're proactive, if you're innovative, and if you're a risk taker, we can kind of grade you on a scale, and it becomes the behavior of your firm, and it becomes part of your corporate culture that you are willing to be proactive and take these calculated risks. And then by 1996, we get Lumpkin and Des, who are two educators from Syracuse and University of North Texas, who talk about the difference between entrepreneurialism and an entrepreneurial orientation. And I think this is where Liz's wonderful experience comes into play. Because whereas entrepreneurialism is coming into the market, being an entrepreneur, being entrepreneurially oriented is the way that you make the entry. What are the processes that you go through to make a successful entry? What are the practices your business engages in? You know, like Liz talked about the neurodivergent community and making special accommodations for the work and the voices of those communities, and the ways in which you make the decisions. So in short, and I'm totally oversimplifying the construct that these two men put out, but it is about the journey and not the destination. And I'd be willing to bet that Liz really demonstrates that spirit because of the journey that she's taken at this point. But you know, Lumpkin and Des also talk about 5 characteristics of entrepreneurially oriented organizations. And then I framed all of this to talk to my higher education and business partners about that. And for example, they said, first of all, yeah, you do have to be innovative. You have to be willing to be novel and willing to be experimental. And they also said you have to be willing to be a risk taker. And a risk taker doesn't mean being reckless. It means being okay with venturing into the unknown and maybe leveraging your assets to ensure some success. Being proactive, in other words, being forward looking and not just being first to be first, but having the foresight to anticipate customer needs. So in Liz's example, I would argue she's been hugely proactive about this because I'm not sure that there is anyone else who is doing what she's doing that is reaching that particular market segment who is looking for a publishing outlet. And so she's demonstrated that proactiveness in that particular way. I also love the idea of competitive aggressiveness because somehow or another we get this idea that aggressiveness is bad. But competitive aggressiveness is the way in which you compete for the demand. How do you relate to your competitors? How do you anticipate what your competition might do? And then finally, do you give your team the freedom to exercise their creativity and champion ideas that are promising? And I use the word champion deliberately because that becomes important later in what I found in that research. So
Dr. Condon, we do have a question real quick from the chat.
Oh, wonderful.
They would like to know, how are you defining entrepreneurialism? Is it only applying to traditional businesses and corporate entities or more broadly?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. The research defined entrepreneurialism as to business. What I did in my study was I defined the ways in which higher education was entrepreneurially oriented. In other words, how did they take the journey to the destination? So that's the difference there. I had schools that said to me, oh, we're very entrepreneurial. Well, they were just focused on the new entry, but they did not always engage in being innovative. They didn't always engage in giving their employees the freedom like I had to negotiate a contract. I mean, if my dean said, Kris, it's okay, you can go ahead and, you know, if you want to teach from 11 to 7 on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, you know, from 11 to 7 a.m., you can do that, even though maybe the faculty contract says I probably shouldn't do that. I had the autonomy to do that in the name of building that partnership. So more specifically, my research focused on the journey as opposed to the destination. I hope that helps clarify. Okay, great. Thanks, Liz. Let me give you an example too of what I saw from those 21 colleges that I surveyed. And I asked them that quantitative information about the ways in which they generated revenue for their institutions so that they they were not perceived as being a drain on the institution. And you'll notice the bars in blue there, those were the 21 stakeholders who I asked questions about their quantitative, their research or their financial findings and that kind of thing. I mean, look at what they did. On a routine basis, these schools generated $2.5 to $3.1 million a year in revenue that could be fed back into the institution. And obviously, the more contracts they generated, the more revenue they generated. And the same was the case for that subset of folks that I interviewed in person, along with their business and industrial partners. They were routinely bringing in $1 million a year. And that's just 3 organizations that were bringing in $1 million a year in corporate revenue with partners. And I found that to be very consistent with the model that we used at Kankakee as well. So I wanted you to see an example of how there really could be value added to paying attention to the journey as well as to that destination. So let me go ahead and cycle back here to the first of the 4 questions that I asked these stakeholders, which was, how do entrepreneurial partnerships support your mission? And of course, I tweaked that question here to say the mission of an Illinois Wesleyan University. And these were some of the things that I found, and I have not parsed these out, separating community colleges from businesses. This is what I found in general, that successful partnerships specifically referenced innovation. Where? In the mission statement, in the identity of the institution, in the strategic plan, in the marketing, in the branding. Innovation was explicit. I didn't have to go and look for it. I could find that it was there, it was visible and present. I also found it to be very interesting and really insightful from a Wesleyan perspective with our new business college, that when you're talking about applied research or entrepreneurial research or the Petrick Idea Center, that applied or action research, as it's sometimes called, needs to be an equal partner with the traditional liberal arts. I had one stakeholder say to me, well, why would you have someone in a business scenario with a liberal arts background? And I said, well, wouldn't there be room for the liberal arts competencies of critical thinking and an approach to embracing opposing points of view and strategies of entrepreneurialism? And it was really sort of a surprise. Well, yeah, I had not really thought of that these are not things that need to be separate, siloed entities, that the applied or the action research really should be an equal partner with the skill sets that we value in a traditional liberal arts education. And further, that businesses really see creative, innovative outreach as being entrepreneurial. Those were the big pluses. On the minus side, I heard universally that businesses would like to see rapid response when there's outreach that's needed. And that wasn't a demand, it was an observation, because I had one industrial partner say to me, we are in an unfortunate situation of downsizing and removing and outsourcing an entire unit, which we are forced to have to do. And we went to a higher education partner who said it would take them 3 years to build the curriculum that this employer needed. And he said, I'm trying to provide buyout benefits to these groups of people who might have no choice but to relocate or to let go altogether. I can't wait 3 years because their mortgage payments won't wait 3 years. Their kids' tuition won't wait for 3 years. And so I did hear businesses say that very frequently they felt that higher education is really risk averse and they avoid being competitively aggressive. And then I also heard them say that they just didn't like a slow response or an inflexibility. And one stakeholder, and it was someone I knew, had said to me, you know, Kris, the fact that you are able to go and do this training on a weekend, we went to places and they wouldn't do that for us. But at your institution, you were willing to do that for us. And we know that the quality control is the same. And you didn't sacrifice the content for us accommodating that schedule. And so I think there is some value to doing that because, of course, we know business and industrial partners, they don't think in 14 or 15 or 16-week semesters. The second question I asked were, what were some of the universal characteristics of these effective partnerships? I mean, was there sort of a list of best practices or a toolbox of characteristics of really effective entrepreneurial partnerships? And what I found was that both sides said, if you're innovative and if you're proactive, it's much easier to sustain those partnerships. And again, if institutions are not willing to take risks and they're not willing to be competitive in trying to build that partnership, it makes it harder for the business to engage in a relationship. And I had one stakeholder say to me that they were frustrated by hearing higher education frequently cite statutory guidelines and state administrative guidelines as an excuse for not practicing entrepreneurialism. I had one stakeholder say, you know, Kris, we all know you've got the registration paperwork to fill out to stay legal with the state. But to go beyond that and say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that, it's policy. Businesses don't think like that. Businesses look for ways to create new policy, to spur new growth, to be able to come up with new journey paths to reach the destination. And they want higher education to be able to do the same. Because a couple of my stakeholders told me that they found higher education frequently to be so risk averse that they foreclosed their own entries or their own opportunities for new entry. They were so rule bound by whether those were internal rules or not, that they missed an opportunity to partner with the very businesses that make up the fabric of the community in which the institution is located. And both institutions and business partners said it's really important to stay current with the market and consulting with local business, because if you do that, you're perceived as more innovative and you have that entree. And certainly the Petrick Idea Center is a fabulous example of that. Being current, making sure that what we're offering this next generation of students is innovative and creative, but it is also rapidly responsive to what a business would hope for from us. My third question really dealt with initiation. How would you go about launching this partnership? And boy, I got a great toolbox of best practices here. The number one response that I got was use your local economic and workforce development board. And those are named different things in different states. But in Illinois, every segment of the state where a community college sits on a regional workforce investment board. McLean County is part of a workforce investment board as well. Those are made up of the business and the industry stakeholders that want to hire your graduates, make sure they have good paying jobs, good communities in which to live and work and raise their families and educate their kids, and build homes and have a future. And so the number one place to be able to launch those connections would be those local economic and workforce boards. But I also heard both higher ed and business and industry say, it is fabulous when there's an outreach of a bridge from a certificate to a degree. So let me give an example of this. Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, we'll just use State Farm as an example. Let's assume that perhaps State Farm is deciding to start some type of executive training academy for identified future executives, you know, regional support managers, that they might be able to move up within the organization, and they're identified as high caliber, high quality employees who for whom an investment would be a good risk for State Farm. So in that example, is there a benefit to taking, let's say, an existing set of Illinois Wesleyan courses, let's say in entrepreneurialism and business, packaging those as a certificate, labeling it, for instance, as the State Farm Training Academy, and moving this cohort through that group? They are Illinois Wesleyan students, they are Illinois Wesleyan alumni, and all of a sudden, this package of 5 or 6 courses, you all of a sudden have a student who says, I think I would like to continue my Wesleyan experience. And guess what? All of that bridge of that certificate moves straight into an Illinois Wesleyan degree. Where's the loss to the institution in doing that? We've invested in the community. We've built a partnership with State Farm. We've kept the quality and the quantity and the academic rigor of our content. And we've built a good relationship with them. We also knew that with initiating outreach, as I mentioned earlier, that people weren't interested in hearing its policy. Policy was not an excuse for inaction. And then this next point is important. I mentioned the word champions a little bit earlier. Most of the research reflected that the president is the champion, that the president is the one who essentially builds the relationship and is the person who cultivates that relationship. However, my findings came up with something a little bit different. I found that successful partnerships had what I termed the closer. And since I'll never be able to coin anything really inventive like that in the rest of my life, I coined the term the closer. That the closer is the person to whom this project is handed off from the president. That's the person who cuts through the bureaucratic red tape, makes sure that everything stays on time, on task, on target, that the customer in this construct is satisfied, that they partner with the faculty and all of the stakeholders to make sure that the rigor is there. And that closer reports back to the champion, who, again, in most examples, is the president. I also found that personal contact and campus visits and communication are important. And that needs to be a continuing process. I had some community colleges who said, well, you know, we went and did a mass mailing and we never heard anything. Well, did you follow up? Well, no, but we did a mass mailing, but we never heard anything. Well, we know that it takes multiple contacts. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir in the alumni office. How many times do you have to send out an all-in for Wesleyan message during all-in day to get the fabulous number of people we got? It was those wonderful reminders that encouraged that participation. This is the same kind of thing. So having that personal contact, the invitation to campus visits, and communication like you're seeing with the Petrick Idea Center are fabulous ways to launch that outreach. But once it's launched, then it has to be maintained. And so my fourth question was, what does it take to maintain and sustain this type of partnership? And my findings here revealed that regular feedback and meetings with the closer are necessary. Can it be with the champion? Of course. But in most situations, a champion had, again, delegated a lot of the daily logistics to the closer. So that closer is that person who needs to be responsible for maintaining and continuing the cultivation of that partnership. I also found that good maintenance came by starting with the end in mind. And I'll give you a real life example of this. I had a corporate client who called my associate dean and said, we've got to get Kris out here. We've got to have an Excel training. We've got to have 3 levels of Excel, and we've got to have all of this Excel stuff, Excel, Excel, Excel. And my associate dean and I went out to the client and we said, well, what's the ultimate goal? Well, these people need Excel training. Well, yeah, but what do they do on the job? Well, it turned out, long story short, that the issue was not Excel training for these folks. The issue was math literacy. So giving them an Excel course provides them with no benefit. We have to start with the end in mind and sort of reverse engineer the training from there to ensure that we have the right outcome. Going back to the State Farm example, for State Farm to come to Illinois Wesleyan and say we need an academy, and Wesleyan's response then is, well, we have this 4-year degree, that's not starting with the end in mind. Starting with the end in mind is taking the cluster of courses from the college catalog and coming up with an innovative way to build that academy using existing content that the university already has that is academically rigorous and can be delivered with the same standards and sets of expectations for that State Farm community of people who'd be going to this executive academy. One of the other things I found with partnership maintenance, and this is kind of universal in corporate training, so I wasn't surprised by this, is that a lot of partnership evaluation focuses on whether the learners are satisfied, not whether they learned anything. And I used to laugh and I'd say to my associate dean, this is not helpful for me to know that they like the donuts that were brought in by the food service. I mean, that's participant satisfaction, but that doesn't tell me whether or not they can perform this specific task on the job now integrated with the academic knowledge that we shared with them. And a lot of times not focusing on the results, in other words, what do we want these learners to be able to accomplish, really did affect future training plans. Well, why is that? Because the business or the industrial partner or State Farm is looking at this and saying, well, that's not really what we hoped for. You know, we're glad they liked it, but what did they get out of it that helps us when they come back to the job? And that cycles back to that thinking of integrating action research with the liberal arts, making sure that when we start with the end in mind, we've got points all the way along the way that we can measure and ensure that we're staying on track, because business partners expect more of that. And they say, this is hard fought money that we're using to invest in employees. And we don't just want it to be a smile sheet. We want to make sure that we have quantitative, quantifiable ways that we can measure that learning. So those were—
I've actually had a couple more questions pop up, Dr. Condon.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and do that. Perfect timing as I switch the slide. That's great, Liz. Go ahead.
Wonderful. How do you see the relationship between entrepreneurship and higher education growing and evolving as the landscape of higher education changes?
Well, I'm going to answer the second question first. I think in higher education, in my opinion, it has no choice but to change. Because if it doesn't, we are missing an opportunity to practice our mission, which is to guarantee well-educated people who can be contributors to society and the communities in which we live. And I think what you are also going to see is that higher education and business, out of necessity, are going to have to dance the dance here and figure out some creative ways that they can coexist. Because my findings did initially reveal, you know, business was a little concerned about, is education real world enough? And education was concerned that business would maybe be dictating what goes on in the academy. And so I think what you're going to see is a moving together of these two separate entities, coming up with a way to be able to gracefully coexist with each other. And I would like to think that a lot of what I found could be a bit of a toolkit for ways to be able to build those kinds of relationships. I hope that covered the question.
Next one, did you see any uptick in non-traditional student enrollment while you were conducting these corporate trainings?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, I did. I want to put a little bit of a disclaimer on this because my research did not specifically go into this area. But because of a lot of the corporate training that I did before I even started this project, I did a lot of training in the Microsoft suite of products. And I would do things from computer literacy all the way to, you know, macro writing and data analysis and stuff like that. And one of the reasons that that piqued my interest is because we did initially have situations where a student said, I am so intrigued by this work with Excel, and I'm going to go finish my accounting associate's degree at Kankakee. I have to take an Excel class. Oh, by the way, student services is telling me that I have to retake the Excel class in the credit division that I took in the non-credit division. And my response was, look at the outcomes. Everything was the same. The difference was that the student registered for my course as a matter of community interest. And I'd like to think was spurred on enough by the experience that this student had, decided to move this over. And so one of the things that we did to make that transition more seamless was to ensure that what we did in non-credit had parity with what we did in the credit area. So I did see a lot of that, particularly in the computer applications side of the house. I did see quite a bit of that.
Wonderful, thank you. And are you seeing companies in the 2020s willing to cover or share the cost of creating these entrepreneurial training partnerships? And if so, how are the companies measuring the ROI?
Oh, well, I think there is going to be an increase in that. And what I can tell you, at least anecdotally, is that at my former institution at Kankakee Community College, a lot of corporate training continued during COVID from a distance. And we were rapidly responsive to that. And my successors in that job were rapidly responsive to that by the third-party training providers that they screened very carefully and the types of online instruction that they delivered. And when there needed to be a face-to-face piece, the precautions were taken to make that happen. So there was that kind of consistency that was in place. Restate the last part of that question again, Liz, will you? Because I was trying to get profound there and then I lost my train of thought.
No worries. I'll read the whole thing over to make sure
Please
that I
do.
don't miss anything. Are you seeing companies in the 2020s willing to cover or share the cost of creating these entrepreneurial training partnerships? And if so, how are the companies measuring the ROI?
Thank you. That was the part, the ROI part I didn't get. So the answer in Illinois is yes, they are increasing their coverage of that. The key to this is certainly that higher ed needs to provide an affordable alternative to contracting somebody privately. But it also, when you talk about measuring ROI, it comes back to that original question of measuring results and starting with the end in mind. And I'll just say in a nutshell that there is a training evaluation model that most businesses use. It's called the Kirkpatrick 4 levels of evaluation. And the highest level of learning deals with what did you learn? Did the employee's behavior change? And how did it affect the bottom line? And at least in my experience, the fastest way to get business buy-in is to see if you can move this to the highest level on the scale. In other words, what are the results? So for example, I had a client who came to me and said, we're having these types of issues in our accounting area where we're trying to reduce product waste. And it was a manufacturer, a food product manufacturer. They said, we're trying to reduce product waste here. And so we need this particular set of skills for these people to have to ensure that we are minimizing the waste. That's a result. And so when you go as a trainer, they don't want to hear me talk about Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. But if I can translate that into business terms and say, what are the optimal results you want? In a perfect world, if I come and spend 2 months here, what is it that you want to see happen? Well, I want to see my waste or my theft decrease by 17%. Okay, now I've got something to work from. And we work backwards from there. So if in the higher education space, you can speak the language of the employer, and more often than not, they're driven towards what are the results as opposed to, did Kris Condon like the training? I mean, that's nice to know, but it doesn't affect their bottom line. That's where we start. And that's what I mean by starting with that end in mind. And there are questions that we can ask to be able to work backwards from that. And there are strategies that we're able to use with focus groups and questionnaires to be able to gain the insight on how we impact those results. The short answer is yes, it can be done.
Wonderful. This next question, I definitely want you to answer first, but I have to chime in on this one too.
Sure.
Can this entrepreneurial mindset be applied and adopted by students and faculty in all areas of Illinois Wesleyan University, or is it limited to the business school and Petrick Idea Center?
Oh, Liz, I'm going to let you answer that one first, and then I'm gonna come back around, and we'll do a 1-2 here. Go ahead, my friend.
Perfect. I'm an English major, and up until last summer, I was also double majoring in education. It wasn't until I was diagnosed with some disabling issues that I realized I wasn't going to be able to be in a classroom full time. So I decided it was time to pivot. And I've always loved publishing. I've been published several times over the years. I'm like, okay, what need is not being met? Only 11% of traditionally published authors identify as disabled, and the neurodiverse community is even smaller inside that. So I'm like, okay, this is the direction that I need to go. If you have a great story or a poetry, I want to publish it. Yeah, bring it to me. But I want to help those people specifically that otherwise fall through the cracks. And I would have never learned about any of that if it wasn't for my educational background and my English background. So I only picked up my entrepreneurship minor within the last 2 months.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Liz. That is a great example. And I would add to that, the answer is yes, it can be used anywhere. The obvious locations are in business and the related areas, but I would submit that some of the people I interviewed for my study were involved in healthcare. So you're talking about results-based improvement in healthcare. One of the largest clients I worked with at Kankakee was an integrated health system where everything that we did with leadership training was results oriented. I have made myself available. John and I have had multiple conversations about this. I have made myself available to Illinois Wesleyan School of Education because I believe that even in the classroom, even when faculty feel that they're being bound by, testing, standardized test scores and outcomes and perhaps unfunded state mandates, that we're in a situation where having these kinds of business and industrial partnerships can yield results in the classroom. My very closest friend is an esports coach. He has a state tournament that is not being funded by his institution because they don't have the dollars to do it. But the local credit union is underwriting the entire arena for the esports tournament. In exchange for that, he is sending highly well-qualified cybersecurity interns to this credit union for them to do diagnostic work and computer upgrades. Everybody wins. And there is no dilution in the quality of the content because his assessment reveals that that's exactly the case. And at no point is he in a situation where the credit union is saying, I'm only going to underwrite your sports arena if you do this. That's a great question. Thank you for that.
Kris, I need to jump in here real quick. We
Of
are
course.
coming up to the end of our scheduled time, and I know you're willing to stick around and answer more questions and really appreciate that. But I want to break into the Q&A just for a second to offer our thanks to you for preparing and delivering this great talk on the entrepreneurial spirit in higher education. You've shown us that even higher education can be subject to disruption and things that we have to do on our part to continue to evolve and adapt. So I want to thank our audience. I want to thank you for attending and asking great questions. And given you have some more time, if there's any more questions anybody would like to ask, please bring them forward.
Well, thank you, John, for the opportunity and for everybody's hospitality. It's really been wonderful. And it's just really exciting to be able to see what's going on our campus and all of the wonderful steps that are really, we once again have an institution that consciously chooses to lead by example. And this is a perfect illustration of that. So thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you. Again, we really appreciate you taking your time. I think we'll close, but I want to put in a couple of quick commercials here. We hope to see you if you will tune in for our next Titan Talks Innovation Series webinar. It's going to take place on May 22nd at 12 p.m. Central Daylight Time, and we'll feature Alan Gregerman. Alan's going to talk about unlocking the brilliance in yourself, your colleagues, and your organization. So please be on the lookout for an invitation to register. And if you're in and around Bloomington Normal this weekend, we hope to see you on Saturday for the finals of the Celebrating High School Innovators competition. That event's going to take place at the Memorial Center and the Young Main Lounge in the Joslin Atrium from 9 a.m. till roughly 2:30 p.m. And I hope you'll stop by to see 32 exceptional high school student-led startups from around the country. The event is open to the public. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating and giving us your questions. I want to thank Kris again. Thank you. It's great to always see an alumni who has engaged as yourself and a Loyalty Award winner among our group. And I think I might see a future Loyalty Award winner and other Entrepreneur of the Year potential candidate. And Liz Stein, thank you so much for helping to moderate the Q&A with us today, and for the staff in the alumni events area. Alumni Relations. I really appreciate your support in making this webinar possible. So everyone have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.